evening. We're going to also have our first speaker is going to speak in Spanish. So you have the interpretation option at the bottom for simultaneous translation into English. And the format we're going to have is we're first going to have Mayaki Gorosito speaking from Argentina, and then speaking from the Exma Museum. And then we will have Dr. Andre Odendaal speaking from Cape Town regarding Robben Island. And then we will conclude with Ihab Salud from the University of Amsterdam, reflecting on both talks. And then we will have a Q&A with you, the audience. And we're very much looking forward to this conversation and bringing together two sites that both represent that have become museums, but that began their lives as prisons and as sites of rebellion and exclusion, and both sort of culminating in the 70s and 80s with the Junta in Argentina and the end of apartheid in South Africa. We will begin with Ms. Mayaki Gorosito from Exma in Argentina. Her official title is the Coordinator of International Cooperation, and she is working also with trying to get the site as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We are going to begin with the video, and then Mayaki will join us. Thank you.
Aquí, en la Esma, estuvieron detenidos desaparecidos cerca de 5.000 hombres y mujeres, militantes políticos y sociales de organizaciones revolucionarias armadas y no armadas, trabajadores y gremialistas, estudiantes, profesionales, artistas y religiosos. La mayoría de ellos y ellas fueron arrojados vivos al mar. Aquí, en la Esma, la Armada planificó secuestros y llevó a cabo asesinatos de manera sistemática. Aquí mantuvo a los prisioneros y prisioneras encapuchados y engrillados. Aquí les torturó. Aquí les desapareció. Aquí, en la Esma, nacieron en cautiverio niños y niñas que fueron separados de sus madres. En su mayoría, fueron apropiados ilegalmente o robados. Muchos de ellos y ellas son los desaparecidos vivos que aún seguimos buscando. Aquí, en la Esma, se produjo un crimen contra la humanidad. En el año 1972, la UNESCO aprobó la Convención sobre la Protección del Patrimonio Mundial Cultural y Natural, que ha sido ratificada por 191 países. En 2015, el Estado argentino inició ante UNESCO las gestiones para que el Museo Sitio de Memoria Esma, ex Centro Clandestino de Detención, Tortura y Exterminio, sea reconocido como Patrimonio Mundial, Patrimonio del Nunca Más. Otros lugares de memoria sirven como antecedente de nuestra candidatura. La isla de Gorée en Senegal y el muelle de Balongo en Río de Janeiro, Brasil, testimonios del comercio de esclavos. El campo de concentración y exterminio nazi Auschwitz-Birkenau, en Polonia, símbolo del Holocausto. El Memorial de la Paz de Hiroshima, en Japón, donde se utilizó por primera vez la bomba atómica. El Puente Viejo, en el centro histórico de Mostar, en Bosnia y Herzegovina, expresión de la convivencia en paz después de una guerra étnica. y la prisión de Robben Island, en Sudáfrica, símbolo de la lucha contra el apartheid.
Es una incógnita, es un desaparecido. No tiene entidad, no está.
Trasladado significa, en la jerga de los marinos, que te vas para hablar con Natalio, fusilamiento.
En la Esma era sinónimo de asesinato.
Queremos saber dónde están nuestros hijos, vivos o muertos, pero queremos saber dónde están.
Estar encapuchado o estar en esas condiciones era una especie de limbo en donde sobre nuestra vida solamente decidían otros.
Estaba bastante organizado, no era un lugar donde no se podía estar, simplemente tenía condiciones más duras que otras, porque era muy chico, porque no había aire, porque hacía mucho calor en verano y mucho frío en invierno, porque era todo muy amontonado, y fundamentalmente porque estábamos al lado del lugar donde torturaban.
En el pañol, que llaman ellos pañol, donde se ponía toda la ropa, era todo lo que sacaban de las casas de la gente que habían secuestrado, digamos, levantaban las casas, inclusive yo encontré cosas ahí de la casa donde yo había sido secuestrada.
Tratar de hacer una vida lo más normal posible, de volver a retomar las cosas que a uno le gustaban, que a uno le apasionaban, y no siempre se lo consigue en absoluto. Pero en fin, la tortura, por eso yo digo, comienza un día y creo que no termina nunca.
Es una cosa terrible lo que pasó con las embarazadas, la separación de los niños.
En la Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada, integrantes del grupo de tareas 3.3 decidieron incluirlos en un traslado. Traslado que todos conocemos. Consistió en aplicarles una inyección total, pentonaval, los condujer a los aviones de la muerte, a la participación de los pilotos de la muerte. Es decir, a las víctimas de este grupo se les causó la muerte en forma dolosa. Fueron arrojados mar adentro.
Thank you for that, sharing that video with this Mikey. It's very powerful. I'm going to welcome you and let you carry on. Thank
Gracias.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists with whom I share this panel. I'm very honored to be here today. Good afternoon to all those who are listening to us and taking part. First and foremost, I would like to name on behalf of the Esma Memory Site Museum the opportunity to meet with you all and bring you apologies from Alejandra Naftal, our executive director, because of some unforeseen and unexpected circumstances, and especially thank the University of Abu Dhabi, all the team we've been working with in past months, as well as the New York University in Buenos Aires, Anya Gasum, Jorgelina Rosa, whose fundamental help made this event possible. I would like to give continuity to the content of the institutional video for the museum's candidacy to the UNESCO World Heritage List. In doing so, I would like to summarize some information about our institution. The Esma Memory Site Museum, former Detention, Torture, and Extermination Center, is the Navy Mechanics Center. Until 1976, this school was a prestigious education center in our city, the city of Buenos Aires, dedicated to training sub-commander officers. In a 17-hectare plot, there were 35 buildings, including the war school, the mechanics school, the officers' canteen, and different workshops. State terrorism that unleashed in our country, as from the coup d'etat that took place on 24 March 1976, put a clandestine detention, torture, and extermination center at the former Esma school that housed 5,000 detainees and missing persons, most of whom were murdered. The victims, men and women, were political activists in different organizations, armed, revolutionary, and unarmed organizations as well, social, political, students, union, and religious organizations. Also whole families, children, boys, girls, people who were kidnapped because of extortion purposes, friends, relatives of those who were looked for, and anyone who would express some form of opposition would be kidnapped. The canteen where the museum is now housed the repression, and the whole plot with all the buildings I mentioned was at the service of illegal actions. These actions revolved around the forced disappearance of people, which is a complex crime based on deprivation of liberty, the denial of detention, and the refusal to give the whereabouts of the missing person. When democracy was recovered back in 1983, Esma became a symbol of the crimes committed by the civic military dictatorship. After lengthy and protracted personing led by the peaceful struggle of human rights organizations in Argentina, Argentina has just repealed the impunity laws that protected those who that performed this repression, and in 2016 started to bring unrestricted court cases that have brought more than 900 people involved in crimes against mankind a negative ruling. Most of the lawsuits are still underway. Concurrently, all of the Esma plot was recovered by the city, which had assigned the land back in 1924. Today, we have the Esma Memory Site Museum, the space for the promotion and defense of human rights. That is where crimes were committed and illegal actions were tolerated. Today, we house the museum, the Esma Memory Site Museum, and also offices of human rights organizations and government and regional agencies. Back in 2012, the current director of the museum was entrusted with a museum project for the former officers' canteen building, and it is there where in May 2015, the Esma Memory Site Museum was formally opened. I would like to briefly talk now about the museum's candidacy to the UNESCO World Heritage List. In this regard, I must say and underscore first and foremost that this candidacy is put forward by the Argentinian state, and that it is brought before the UNESCO World Heritage Center as representative of all memory spaces in Argentina. During the civic military dictatorship that we suffered in the country, there were more than 600 of these clandestine detention, torture, and extermination centers. Our candidacy seeks to contribute to the international visibility of the two exceptional universal values it is based on, that is, values that are requested by UNESCO to admit the candidacy. Our two universal exceptional values are: one, negative, that is state terrorism based on forced disappearance of persons, and the positive one, that is the value of social consensus as a means to do justice and achieve justice. We also believe that this is an opportunity to underscore these values, not only in the context of their undoubtable importance as part of the Argentinian history and the history of Mercosur, but also as a contribution to the world's cultural heritage. We believe it is a historical memory which belongs to Argentina, but also to Latin America and the world at large, and we have the obligation and duty to share it, teach it, and make it visible. I would like to recall that the regional context symbolized by our museum was the Condor Plan that was used to coordinate repression by all military dictatorships in Latin America. As I said, the museum is a symbol and it bears a witness to what happened, and it has to be used to build citizenship, not only nationally, but also internationally. Since 2006, an interdisciplinary team, of which I'm a part, has been developing an action plan until in June 2021, we managed the Esma Memory Site Museum to be included or to be put as a candidate for the UNESCO Heritage List. It is a rigorous work that was done committedly and based on strong convictions, including the dimensions that are part of this work plan. One, which is very important, is formulation of the nomination or the candidacy paper. We have received notice from the UNESCO Heritage Center informing the Argentinian government and the museum that we have been approved. The technical review of the case has been approved by the center, and the case is already being discussed by the International Association that is responsible for performing an in-depth analysis of the case and inspecting the museum this year. On the other hand, a very important dimension to us is dialogue, performing activities and gaining support from all social government sectors, as well as from the Argentinian academia and other sectors and academia from the rest of America and the world. Along these lines, I would like to underscore that at a national level, the support received from the House of Representatives, the Senate, as well as local parliaments have been unanimously voted by all political forces. In turn, we need to articulate this work together with ministries, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Ministry for Culture, Environment, and Education. In this regard, I want to underscore the work performed by Marcela Lozardo, our ambassador, who is responsible for the permanent delegation to our UNESCO Paris. And we also have to develop a strategic plan that will underpin Argentina's commitment to the museum. Lastly, I would like to remind you that as part of the actions taken to support our candidacy to the UNESCO Heritage List, 21 April last year, a virtual meeting was held called Art, Memory, and Politics, organized by the New York University in Buenos Aires. Back then, Robert Partesius underscored as follows, quote, "The nomination of heritage sites has to do more with the future than with the past. because we do so for upcoming generations, even if we have no idea what this will be like. So I think it is very important to assess the site because of what it is like today and what it will be like in future and who it will speak to in 100 or 200 years time. This involves not thinking of heritage as something static. I hope that the nomination of the Esma Memory Site Museum will contribute and help these sites bear better witness to the future, end of quote. These words summarize what we are working for at our institution, and I hope this reference will serve as a means of thanks and token to him and our university. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikey. And thank you for all of the questions that actually come from your statement when we look at who these sites belong to and how they're shared. Which brings us to the other side of the world and to a site that's also has many similarities but also differences, and that is taking us to Cape Town and South Africa's Robben Island. And our guest today we are very fortunate to have with us today the first CEO of the Robben Island Museum, which was formed after apartheid was officially ended. And Dr. Andre Odendaal is also an author of books that address this. He was obviously an anti-apartheid activist, and he wrote a book that came out last year called Robben Island, Rainbow Dreams, the making of a democratic South Africa's first national heritage institution. And I know that Buenos Aires has looked to Robben Island as they've formed their statements for UNESCO. And so very welcome to Dr. Andre. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alia, and also to the other colleagues, Veronica, Robert, Ehab, and Nahed. And after that, it's lovely to join you from far away. So let me use one of the few words I know and say shukran for the invitation from everyone. Mikey's introduction was difficult even to listen to after all these years that we know about it. The brutality and horror in such a short, immediate space that Esma celebrates today. Robben Island was a structured systemic discrimination over 342 years of incredible also banishment, exile, imprisonment, and pain, including a leper colony for something like 70 years. So it became known for its institutional brutality over a long period of time. Like other notorious prison islands, of course, for us in Africa, Gore Island, where the slaves left the African continent for the last time. And one can name places like Guantanamo today as examples of these kind of places that become known for their institutional violence, I would say. The island's notoriety grew from April 1961 to 1991 after it was hastily converted into a maximum security prison. So as opposed to the 5,000 people in Argentina who were mostly all killed, there were some 3,500 freedom fighters who were rounded up and sent in shackles to the island for their opposition to apartheid. And the aim of the prison was to both break the morale of the prisoners and also, of course, the resistance that was starting to grow against apartheid in a serious way after the terrible Sharpeville massacre in 1960 and the banning of organizations as part of that clampdown. What was particularly obnoxious about this place is that all the warders were white and all the prisoners were black. People in the early days in particular suffered unspeakable humiliation as well, being buried up to their neck and urinated on, being called all sorts of names, being made to work in the stone quarry, sometimes barefoot. The poet Dennis Brutus reminds us, on sharp rocks in this very cold Atlantic Ocean. And the food matched the conditions. African prisoners, in accordance with apartheid, could get bread only once a year at Christmas time. Otherwise, it was porridge for breakfast and supper. And in clothing as well, they were differentiated against other black prisoners as well from different ethnic groups, wearing no underclothes, shorts, sandals, and so on. I noticed how the ex-prisoner on the previous clip spoke about the cold. The prisoner spoke about the terrible cold there. They slept on the floor, very cold, wet winters where the rain comes from in Cape Town, and thin mats with 2 blankets. There was censorship, 1 visit every 6 months, letters that looked like windows cut out in any reference to anything happening in day-to-day life besides family matters and so on. So it was a place made to break people and the struggle. But as we all know, it became a place also of life, resilience, growth, and imagination. Robben Island, unlike what we've just heard about Argentina, was a place that had a ballroom dancing champion, for instance, amongst the prisoners. People organized sport, even though they were refused originally. Artworks and creativity, together with collective action. There's a book on political prisoners in Czechoslovakia, which shows their isolation and their tremendous personal suffering over 20 years through that isolation. In Robben Island, it became the university of struggle. People were next to each other in solidarity. And one of the most amazing things about it was the genius, really, of the South African struggle was that despite the huge indignities visited on the oppressed and the narrow racialized mindset of the power structure under which the majority of South Africans lived during apartheid, they still managed to assert their humanity and imagination of an inclusive future based on Ubuntu, I am a person because of you, respect, inclusivity, and universal values in powerful ways that ultimately changed the country. So the key to survival there was the way in which they stood together in solidarity. There was an informal code of conduct which reminded people that at all times they must advance the cause of the struggle. So some of Nelson Mandela's co-prisoners, for instance, Walter Sisulu was known to give a prisoner who had nothing, you know, the toothbrushes of his comrades and so on, who had what he regarded as a lot. They shared everything. And Mandela noted that the prison constitutes its own society, even if inmates are coerced into membership, and therefore to maintain their dignity and beliefs individually and organizationally, they set out to create an own world within a world. And I think this aspect of the Robben Island experience is particularly important, given also how the museum arose. So the prison is above all punitive. It operates to break the human spirit, to exploit human weakness, undermine human strength, destroy initiative, individuality, negate intelligence, and process an amorphous robot-like mass. So you get a number there and you lose your name. The great challenge, he said, Mandela, is how to resist, not how to adjust, but to keep intact the knowledge of society outside and live by its rules, for that is the only way to maintain the human and social within you. So in the course of the 30 years, the prisoners, through their resistance and standing together in these deprived environments, sharing everything, eventually came in a way almost to run the prison, and eventually to emerge from there to become leaders of the new country. More than half the members of the ANC in the first parliament in 1994, after democracy, had been on Robben Island. And so out of that experience, in a place in a hellhole where people were supposed to be broken, but they like to, the narrative that came out of that was the triumph of the human spirit. And Ahmed Kathrada summed this up by saying, we will not forget the brutality of apartheid. We do not, while we will not forget it, we will not want Robben Island to be a monument of our hardship and suffering. We want it to be a monument reflecting the triumph of the human spirit against the forces of evil, a triumph of freedom and human dignity over oppression and humiliation, a triumph of wisdom and largeness of spirit against small minds and pettiness, a triumph of courage and determination over human frailty and weakness, a triumph of non-racialism over bigotry and intolerance, a triumph of the new South Africa over the old. So that is the context that we were lucky to be given the task in 1996 to set up, when the prison closed, to set up Robben Island Museum as a national museum and eventually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the profoundness of that moment, given the experiences that South Africa was going through, there was the official aim in tune with the spirit of our new democracy was the opposite of control and darkness and violence, to nurture creativity and innovation and contribute to socio-economic development, the transformation of South African society, a highly skewed 342-year-old racist colonial society and unequal in every way, and also to promote the enrichment of humanity, the universal views once again. Although it was a national liberation struggle, people saw themselves in a universal sense of trying to build something new, which is what made living and working in that time an absolute amazing thing. So for us who worked on Robben Island, who were given that task, literally to take the prison key out of my pocket on the 1st of December and give it to an ex-prisoner and a child to symbolically throw open the prison doors was quite beyond kind of being able to explain in terms of the profoundness for all of us, and also the profoundness of throwing open the prison doors in that symbolic way. One small step towards healing and to change in South Africa as we saw it then. And we had to do it in a very modest way, which is part of how we created meaning. Literally, because prisoners missed the voices and the sounds of children, some did not touch a child for 16, 20 years. You can imagine that deprivation, but they heard these voices in the distance sometimes and had this tremendous longing for children to be part of this new setup. So an ex-prisoner together with children turned that lock, and there was the pitter-patter of bare feet into a place that for 342 years had been so exclusionary and closed. Also, another example of that symbolism, working with that symbolism rather perhaps than concentrating on marketing this beautiful island in the bay and trying to compete with the Smithsonians, who compared to our 20 million rand, which is about $2 million, built the Holocaust Museum for $200 million in 6 years, and the African American Museum, the beautiful one run by Lonnie Bunch now, cost 800 million and took 8 years to create. We had to take over that island in a matter of a few months using what we had, and that meaning was created by the ex-prisoners. For instance, when we opened the island in 3 months, given the demand for access to the place where prisoners had been kept, we did it by using the prison boats, by using the ex-prison warders, in fact, as part of this reconciliation that was being, part of Mandela's Rainbow Nation dream. And then having the ex-prisoners take the people through the island and explain personally to them. And the notion of a pilgrimage was built into that. So we do not have waterways in South Africa, rivers that go inland. So for many people, getting on a boat for the first time, going into beautiful Table Bay, was a very profound experience, so that your crossing and then your experience there and your return, takes you out of your normal comfort zone, makes you think of the experience, and hopefully come back understanding the inclusivity that we were trying to build. So that's briefly, some of the feelings that we had in those first years. The soft aspect again of creating this meaning for us happened through creativity. At the core of our actions were educational programs for school children as a particular priority, cultural activities including writers and artists in residence, joint projects with community groups. For instance, when the island was set up, some of the proposals were that children should be, street children should be sent there so that it can be a work farm where they could be productively engaged and disciplined. For us, part of our programs was to bring school children on this amazing journey at that time to the island, and to spend a weekend with them and support groups doing artwork and craft and healing activities for children who had nowhere to stay. That was the kind of mindset behind us. One of our 4 core essences was lifelong learning and critical debate. And we wanted to introduce that into Robben Island as a learning institution, not just a site or a place where tourists came to visit, but learning at the core of the experience. And we worked with local universities, for instance, in a country where Black people had never been managers in museums, to start heritage training projects with local museums. Also because access is difficult, a part of our community was to take the Robben Island on the Move exhibitions to schools and to different provinces and so on. So the whole thing of engagement with the community was very crucial to us. I'm going to have to do it quite shortly now, not be able to go into that. But we had, for instance, artists in residence coming to stay on the island for up to 3 weeks. And the artworks that were created there were used as calendars, became part of exhibitions, and we had great writers like Ariel Dorfman and Wole Soyinka coming, who wanted to start an African Writers' Parliament on Robben Island, which we thought was a wonderful idea. Dorfman said that people should be able to run naked down to the harbor if they wanted to. That wasn't going to happen under our watch, but it was the right idea in terms of opening up the space that had been closed for 3 centuries. In terms of the socio-economic aspect, which is one of the issues that Alia asked us to speak about, as I said, 20 million rand in a few months were to take over the island and build an organization in a work in progress kind of way. And but we had to therefore be very careful how we try to create the balance between running a 480-hectare island with 100 houses on it, the size of the city center of Cape Town, bringing tourists to it because there was a massive demand to go out to the island. And using the model again, I remember, or we've written about at the time, that for every dollar spent at the Smithsonian, an additional $16 were pumped into the local economy. And by this measurement, we had 1 million visitors within 5 years. We raised money to build our own gateway building on the mainland for 45 million rand. We created 1,000 job opportunities. We trained 300 people who emerged with graduate qualifications in heritage and so on. So there was that emphasis that we had to do that. But the original plan was very much that it is a living museum around which we think and debate and develop towards new identities and cultural expressions in a space that had been totally closed. Unfortunately for us, with the ex-prisoners always at the forefront of our thinking, and the Robben Island Memories program, where people were interviewed, brought back in 25 or 36, in fact, work groups. People who lived in certain areas of the prison were brought out together and spent a weekend on the island to remember their memories and be asked how things were done and how they should be done. And also in the creation of displays. Unfortunately, after 5 years, we had a rupture, I would say, caused by dissension of, that emerged also from conflicts within the ex-political prisoner ranks. And we write about this in the book. I resigned at that stage rather than be forced to change a contract for a ferry operation in midterm to disadvantage the museum and advantage certain people, for instance. And we maintain in our book that this was a pilot case for the later state capture that has so tarnished South Africa's legacy of struggle in the last 10 years. And that was something that we experienced in 2002-03. And the unfortunate result of that was that the educational kind of initiative and base of the museum was undermined. It became a place that became politically controlled, much more. A lot of projects fell away, publishing fell away, and I think it's commonly acknowledged now that the museum, went into a sort of period of instability, which today's leadership is still trying very hard to get out of. It basically, what we realized, I think, the lesson we learned is you don't destabilize an institution and then just put it up again, by filling in a flip chart and appointing a few more new people. It takes time to build an institution, and institutions need to be nurtured and protected. So let me end it at that point and see if there are any questions. Thank you very much. Oh, could I just show you, Alia? Sorry, I've got.
Yes. Yeah.
It'll be very quick.
Okay.
If I could just show you some of the pictures, I'll do it. Robben Island is 500 hectares in the middle of Table Bay, spectacular sights towards Table Mountain. And sorry, I'll take just 2 minutes to finish. So there was the kind of, that was Robben Island opening in 1961. It was very much a kind of colonial kind of, uniforms and guns and prisoners being brought off boats, really reminiscent of a kind of slave narrative of people chained together being brought off the boat and forced into a prison they had to more or less build themselves. And this is the B section where the most well-known prisoners were kept. And obviously people worked very hard in different quarries and so on during those times. So for us, it was for those people who'd come to Robben Island in chains to come back and to open the doors with us on that day. This is Kwedim Kalipi, a Pan-Africanist Congress prisoner. You can just see the absolute joy and amazingness of that day in that picture. And that is me welcoming the ex-prisoners onto the island and then walking, very simple but very beautiful moment, walking up to the prison to open the prison doors. And there are Lizo Mungwana, a wonderful man who'd been there, was now helping the children open the doors symbolically with the ex-prisoner, political prisoner representatives there. And you can see the presence of children. That's me there, if I may say, and my son who was 2, and the children of ex-political prisoners over here. And there you are now in this place of pain being opened up, and the ex-prisoners now reclaiming the narrative and telling the story from their perspective after all those years. It was a very, very profound experience for us all. And the idea of the rainbow dream for us was not some impossible mirage that we were in search of. It was about a country that came together in which the fundamental transformation happened. And this was our poster for Millennium Night 2000 on Robben Island, where we had the Millennium celebrations. And to me, that represented the aesthetic, the beauty, and the rainbow dreams that we were talking about. That show went on to more than well over 1,000 performances in New York, London, China, India, and many other places after its debut performance on Robben Island on that night. And that again is how we use the heritage and legacy in ways that could also contribute socially and economically, I would say. And at midnight, while the cacophony of thousands of tons of fireworks went off all around the world, at 12 o'clock, Nelson Mandela stood in his cell with a flickering candle to greet the next 1,000 years. It was a time of incredible optimism and hope, in which we believed we could do things. We were incredibly productive. 20 books on Robben Island that were brought out. So for me, any cultural project that deals with legacy must also bring out artworks, bring out books, bring out films, because of the need for people's experiences to be recognized and so on. Also, we were involved in changing the iconography in the South African Parliament, all the old apartheid signs coming off, and the World Artists Against Apartheid exhibition coming in its place. I'll have to end there. But also this one I love because it was about children, and the beautiful space for children to learn. We had a little school on Robben Island, and it's very, very heavy weather there. So we had 2 shipwrecks during my time, and the school would then be bundled into transport to go and see the rescue operation happening. And if there was penguins being collected to protect them, the children would be involved. It was a wonderful learning environment for children as we try to create a new culture and a new identity for us as South Africans. Not an identity, but identities which were liberated. And you can see, spiritually, churches, mosques and other people, also traditionalists, traditional religion people, coming to the island to slaughter a goat to appease the ancestors. It was a very profound experience for people to come into that space of pain. People would burst into tears in staff meetings and meetings like this. These are archbishops and so on. We had, also, of course, all the people, because Mandela had been there, from the Secretary General to Castro and Clinton. Yasser Arafat coming to the Kramat on Robben Island, where 250 years earlier, political prisoners from Indonesia had been kept by the Dutch, and so on. The many levels at which Robben Island had to operate as we developed this organization come out in some of these pictures. And of course, when Nelson Mandela arrived for the first time on the island, he had no bodyguards. He came and posed with us all, and that was almost this kind of dream of freedom that we had then. It didn't take long before the presidents arrived with many bodyguards and kept people away from them and so on. But the dream of freedom and liberating the space and healing it of pain through education and cultural togetherness was very strong. Also in South Africa, where there'd been no black museologists, suddenly we had a whole new, our staff was effectively the new demographic of South Africa, you know, an inversion of the 95%, 5% of the past. So I'll end, where shall I end this? Oh, this is beautiful. So the prisoners, when they came back, would tell us what things had meaning for them. And so there's a person who donated his shoes that a fellow prisoner had put rabbit fur in because he had arthritis in those cold winters, and those shoes meant a lot to him. The triumph of the human spirit. So just with a few pieces of cement paper, cement bag paper, you did a chess set. And this is a beautiful belt created from material picked up on the island by prisoners. Thank you, Alia. I'll end there so that I don't abuse your time. Thanks.
For that presentation. And it gives a lot to think about, that mix of tragedy and when it started, the joy you saw in rebuilding it, and the sorrow you now feel about what's happened. It comes through very, very clearly. And on that note, I know we have some questions, and I also apologize to some of the younger people in the audience that may not have studied the juntas and apartheid yet and are being a little bit having the historical context not there for them, as I'm seeing in some of the questions in the chat. But I think the idea of trauma and suffering is something we all recognize in present day situations as well. And how do you remember that? Which brings me to our final speaker, who is Dr. Ihab Salul, who's going to reflect on what both our speakers have been saying, and This is at the heart of so much of his work. He does work in Argentina, but he is the co-founder and research director of the Amsterdam School of Heritage, Memory, and Material Culture at the University of Amsterdam, and a professor of memory and narrative at the International Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, Umberto Eco, at the University of Bologna. And he's the editor of 2 book series, Heritage and Memory Studies from Amsterdam University Press, and the Palgrave Studies in Cultural Heritage and Conflict. And he has, as I said, worked in Argentina, but also many other places. So Dr. Ihab, welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Alia, for this generous introduction, and welcome to all of you. I will spend the next few minutes actually to reflect a tiny bit on some of the issues that Andre and Micah presented about these 2 amazing sites of memory, and I will say why they're amazing, and how actually some of the issues that we are dealing with in terms of the relationship between sites of memory and how actually they can be transformed into what I call heritage sites of trauma. Before I I go into the topic, maybe it's good to mention that actually I direct the Amsterdam School for Heritage, Memory, and Material Culture. This is a research institute and a doctoral school actually that combines several disciplines from museum studies, heritage memory studies, post-colonial studies, media, art, archaeology. So there's a wide range of disciplinary background within this school. Currently, the school hosts more than 100 PhD students and several postdoc projects and other senior members. So the work that we do is actually diverse around several themes, ranging from museums and memorials to heritage and conflict to transnational memory narratives, into digitality and the whole digital turn in heritage and memory studies, and also the relationship to materiality and material cultural studies. So the whole relationship to archaeological finds, traces, etc. I think bringing these 2 sites, the Esma site and the Robben Island site, next to each other is actually a very good and learning experience for both, I think, exactly because both of them are representing horrific sites of memory of trauma and suffering. And as I said, actually the challenge, this is almost not questionable, this kind of history. The challenge is actually how do we transform, or how can we rethink these sites of memories or these sites of sufferings and trauma into heritage sites, and how can they transform into that kind of tangible entity. Of course, that takes a lot of work, as we heard from Andre's presentation in the case of Robben Island, and also from Mikey's. It takes a lot of work in terms of social and political consensus, which is available. But also there are several theoretical questions that come also with this kind of work, our theoretical conceptual frameworks that actually we are dealing with when we are thinking about how do we deal with memorial centers or memorial sites of trauma. Some of these questions, I will just mention them briefly, is actually how do we consider, for example, the moral and the ethical questions around inclusions, around exclusion, around several aspects of authenticity, for example, in relation, for example, to the whole representation of different or sometimes competing or contested narratives of victimhood and perpetration, and also survivals in generations after. So I think the work what Esma and what Robben Island has done can be also exemplary to the work that Esma is doing now, exactly because they are moving a step forward to become a UNESCO heritage site. And actually, I know that they are involved in some of these processes. And maybe the key word that I want to bring into our discussion today is what we call the intersectional or the intersectorial network and learning from each other. So actually this is at the heart of my project with Esma today, is that actually we try from, let's say, to bridge the gap between the theory of heritage and the practice of heritage, and how actually we can learn from each other, both exchanging in terms of knowledge exchange and transfer, but also in terms of developing new ways and new understandings in terms of the academic, but also of the professional practice of heritage and memory. So we are engaged in several activities with some of these sites in Argentina, Esma, and other sites, to rethink actually some of the relationship, for example, between heritage, trauma, and memory, art. What is the role of art and performing and performance, for example? How can we engage, for example, new social subjects, and actually how can we develop, let's say, more engagement from community and local narratives? So these are some of, in general lines, that I'm just presenting for our discussion later on, that actually some of the topics that we are dealing with, moving from how do we tell the story on the site, how do we engage more actors or social actors in these stories. And I think, as I said, I'm fascinated by the work that has been done by Andre and Robben Island, because through their history, they have developed these steps over the years. So it takes time actually to develop this fully fledged, let's say, plan for how to cover all the aspects that you need in your museum or your heritage site in relation to working within and also working with other actors in the field. The issue of tourism, for example, is very important, I think. And also what Andre mentioned about this whole idea of competing stakeholders, that almost in every site of memory, there's a lot of different stakeholders involved in the process of the making of the site, but also in the functioning and the management of the site. However, I think for Argentina, for Esma, there's, as I said, a great social and political consensus around this topic. So that aspect is a bit clear, at least, to work with from a heritage and memory perspective. The difference, however, maybe one of the main differences between the Robben Island and the Esma site is what we call actually with the whole idea of witnessing and the relationship to archives and the relationship to traces. As you saw from Andre's presentation, for example, we have material objects, for example, that actually are available on the island and that have been used as part of the musealization of the island. And I will say something about musealization in a minute. But actually, in the case of Esma, what makes this place is so specific and also so exciting to work with is that almost the archives and the whole traces are made up of stories of survival. So, for example, in Robben Island, the ex-prisoners played a role in, or maybe came to visit back the site of the suffering. While actually in Argentina, we are dealing with almost the whole case of the disappeared, that actually these victims do not have the chance to come back. What we are dealing with is that their families or the survivors of the future generations are the one who have the mission, let's say, to activate this site. So this is a huge difference in terms of archiving and in terms of traces of violence, and how do we deal with that? So this is an important topic, I think, that also can be taken to our discussion in relation to how do we deal with different stories on this site, or multi-layered landscapes or multi-layered narratives in relation to victims, to perpetrators, and to survivors afterwards. Of course, this takes a lot of work also in relation to what we call the whole national discourse of violence, and how do you link that with the whole transnational knowledge of this kind of story or episode of violence. And also the other, of course, big question is actually how do we deal with the official narrative, let's say the ministerial or the governmental narrative of the site, and also how do we integrate that with what we call local or counter memories or counter narratives that actually are not part of the official story of the site. So I think some of the questioning or some of the challenges that can be directed to working with these sites, as I said, it can be also a very good learning experience to bring these two different cases in a comparative lens and to try to understand some of the processes that have been, for example, done on Robben Island or other sites of memory, let's say the Auschwitz or other places of suffering. And also, I think that will be very important for Esma to consider some of these processes of how to work with them. With regard to musealization, and this is what I will end up with actually, my reflection, one of the key elements that we are discussing in our project around this topic of memory, heritage, and trauma and the relationship to social and cultural and artistic practices is that we are actually functioning from a particular perspective of memory. For example, what we are trying to argue in this kind of approach is that for memory to be active, or even activated for that matter, and to have a transformative impact, it must not be musealized and frozen in particular cultural or artistic or socio-political discourses. Instead, what the memory must be able to reach to new kinds of social actors, and must also develop new forms or creative forms of interaction with political, social, and cultural sectors in different contexts. So actually the whole idea of this whole topic around heritage and memory of suffering and places of suffering and trauma is to think of a dynamic approach of memory construction, and also as a memory as a process of meaning construction and reconfiguration at the same time. So it's not just about articulation of memory, but it's also about changing how actually these memories are continuously changing in the present and the future. The whole idea of working with future generations is also very important, I think, in the case of Esma and in the case of several sites. So for example, we have been also thinking about this whole notion of education and pedagogy, and how do we tell actually historical narratives in the present. As you see, like there's the official history books that we are being taught in the classrooms, for example, but also with new knowledge and new, for example, think about the whole colonial heritage, for example. Now we have a new knowledge and new narratives of colonialism, and how do you integrate that, for example, in pedagogy and education, schooling, children's schools, etc. So this is, I think, very important question that we can take into our discussion to actually maybe to see how actually not just we are busy with representing the past in relation to the present, but also we want to engage more, or how do we teach this kind of history, traumatic history in the present and the future for other generations. Thank you very much. Ali, I'm done.
I got it. So you gave us a lot to think about. I was writing down notes. But yeah, that and I think there's a lot I think a lot of times we think about trauma sites that are happening right now, and what is our role in remembering now for what inshallah will not be the trauma one day, or will not be the conflict it is at the moment, let's say. I think there's questions that are coming in that I want to address, but I think I'm going to start with this one from Jean-Louis. Robben Island and Exma are excellent cases with many lessons to learn from for human history. However, the issue is whether these kinds of sites fall under the scope of World Heritage Convention. Inscription of Robben Island was very controversial, and it is mainly the outstanding experience of Nelson Mandela that made the site an example of justice and reconciliation. Let's look for the truth and reconciliation. So I think this is something that Exma is dealing with at the moment. Also, the idea of why should this be a site, a World Heritage Site, and is that even necessary or helpful? And Mikey's ready to talk. I see her hand up. Mikey, please.
Gracias, Alia. No, quería hacer una referencia justamente a eso. En este momento se están llevando adelante los debates en el seno del Centro del Patrimonio Mundial respecto
as to the type of inclusion or the type of criteria that the inclusion should take into account of memory sites or trauma memory sites, recent sites in the UNESCO heritage. Until a short time, very few months ago, a document was going around, referred to by the World Heritage, that suggested or proposed not to allow the inclusion of more memory sites into the list of UNESCO memory sites. For our work of candidacy for the list plus the UNESCO sites, it is very important to participate in these debates because we believe this is essential to keep including memory sites into the UNESCO heritage list, on how we conceive the heritage as something live, something that belongs to the community, something that has to be diverse and has to contribute to the promotion and defense of human rights. On the one hand, and if you allow me, Alia, I would also like to say that, as he have said, our consensus is essential for this work, not only for candidacy, but for the creation of the museum itself. Before being opened, the museum was presented more than 200 times by the team to different sectors of the Argentine society, and mainly to the survivors of the former Esma, the former clandestine center of detention, torture, and extermination. Our center has a very deep relationship with the survivors of the museum. And also, we try to generate debates related to the present time and the agendas, precisely the agendas tomorrow, March 8th, to the agendas of feminism or the agenda of a green tide, that we call it in Argentina, Marea Verde, to reflect and to give visibility to all sexual crimes performed in the former clandestine center of detention. And for that, we work together with the women survivors of our center. Thank you, Alia.
Thank you. I think that Andre and Ihab probably both want to respond to that. Andre, because as our questioner asked in the chat, there is some issue about whether Robben Island should have been a World Heritage Site.
If you can give that question to me just now, I will do it. I wanted to, Siraj Rasool mentioned that the World Heritage Site status that Robben Island got has actually complicated its existence, because there are 23 laws now that that Robben Island has to adhere to in terms of conservation and ticking boxes and so on. And that the fact that the site has now become a World Heritage Site, more than perhaps the living museum that people focused and involved, as it's been affected by that status, the demands of maintaining the level demanded by World Heritage Site status, and that in fact that has perhaps taken the museum in the direction more of becoming a tourism site rather than a place that deals with meaning and memory that much. And also, given the depression that I think, and chaos and corruption and terrible political performances of our country in the last while, I think it's also the whole notion of the triumph of the human spirit is undermined, so that the brand of Robben Island, that, you know, what it tried to stand for in the 90s is very is massively undermined. And there seems to be a tendency, there's a new CEO, Abigail Tulare, who started 3 months ago. She's a wonderfully competent and really forward-looking person, and hopefully she will be able to pull together from the immense complexity of the situation at the moment, the museum into a future direction, you know, the 21st century identity of the museum. But it's going to be very difficult to take it back from a tourism-oriented, income-generating situation, which could perhaps still be like that as a World Heritage Site, but it does affect the kind of theoretical and learning aspects that we started off with, I would say. So there's also a demand by some ex-prisoners that the site gets handed over to them and the Department of Trade and Industry, so that you can have all sorts of commercial activities there to maximize income at a time when people are in very distressed economic circumstances. You know, 60% of young South Africans out of work and so on. So you have these contestations now as a result, as a result of the vacuum that was created by the instability that the institution went through. It's also understandable in a generational sense. After 30 years, this is now the dominant feeling out there. So there's contestation on those levels.
Thanks. Yeah, I think, right. Thank you, Andre, for that. Did you want to address that one?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I share Andre's sentiment actually, and I towards UNESCO, the whole move to UNESCO and World Heritage Site, because at least I speak about it as a theoretical, as a theoretician or an academic. So I see actually the limitations, you know, like it's an aspiration to be, it's good to aspire to be a World Heritage, but it doesn't come with without problems, you see? And it changes also the conceptual framework of the place itself. So actually for the institution, it's good to be aware, for example, for Esma, it's good to be aware of some of these limitations, and maybe to be prepared also how to deal with them in the long term, because this is, as Andre said, will influence both the institution, but also the concept of the institution. So I think it's important, it's good to do that. It's good to be on the World Heritage Site. And I think for Argentina, this is very important to do that, especially for that episode of history. But I think as an institution, it takes some thinking actually how we can deal with that kind of move, to move from the site of memory and consciousness, for example, into a heritage, World Heritage Site. So it's good to understand that UNESCO is not always the, you know, like the, how do you say that, the magic button that can solve everything, and especially in relation to tourism. But I think there's actually something positive about Esma's site itself, because the site is the school site. It's not just the torture place of the museum. And in that school site, what they have done, Andre, or what they have, is that they accommodated a lot of institutions. So there's a lot of sectors within that society that are represented, and they're not per se like organizations, etc., movements. They are not per se musealized, or they don't need to be musealized. So the kind of the spatial, unlike Robben Island, which is like a kind of a whole spot, let's say, Esma had occupies one part of that whole school, and there the other side of the school actually is occupied, or let's say functions with a different organization. So maybe that can be also another element, not just to bridge the gap and to collaborate more with these institutions, but in case they become World Heritage Site, I think it can also be very useful for them to, let's say, to distinguish the museum from the other organizations. So that might be a kind of positive development that can help them to overcome some of the limitations of UNESCO. But I will talk.
No, I think that's, I mean, and I'm gonna kind of sum up because building on what you've just said, on all three of you, I'm gonna sum up some of the questions into, I think, a question about this idea of, you know, you see what happens, and if it becomes UNESCO World Site, what if happens as a tourism site? Like, a lot of people go to Robben Island now because it's fun and it's pretty, and so there's a lot of detachment from its original purpose for being a heritage site, and that the trauma, so apartheid is gone, but the trauma of apartheid still exists. And the junta is gone in Argentina, but if we look at Latin America, we still see dictatorships, and we still see repressive regimes. So what are the roles of these sites to be windows into, what responsibility do they have to the present? And I don't know who would like to address that. Yeah,
I'll try just a sentence or two without pretending it's of any value, but it's really, for me, the unfulfilled vision that we had, I think, invites us to go back to re-examine what went wrong, but this time acknowledging the changed context, where a new generation of imaginations, ideas, actions, loyalties, and languages must be engaged with. So to hang on to the old master narrative is a futile exercise. And we've had a very dynamic student Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, and the priorities are different, and the imaginations today are different politically and culturally to what they were in the 90s. And how does one, and that's where EAB's intersectionality comes into play. How does one create these multiple spaces for multiple engagements? I think that's a challenge. And for me, culture is a wonderful way of doing it, because when you see an artwork and you listen to a musical composition, for instance, on Robben Island, one ex-prisoner built a saxophone from flotsam and jetsam and played music on it even a few years later. And when we launched the museum, one of our artists played a piece called Foghorn from dried seaweed on the island as a flute and so on. And you then start transcending in all sorts of imaginative ways the kind of apolitical position and so on by having this kind of activity going there. And it must relate to the young people. And I think, Ms. Tulare is a very, very switched on person. We are also living in a time of the fourth industrial revolution, and how do you sort of engage with younger people in that time is another big issue.
Yeah, did you want to say something?
No, actually, I just wanted to say that this whole idea of flexibility of the institution is very important, and actually will be crucial to the success and the failure of this, because usually with musealization or the fixation of it's difficult to escape that part. Yeah, musealization is always part of it, but comes with musealization also a kind of fixation of narrative. So it takes actually on the behalf of the institute some kind of open-mindedness to be actually thinking about how can I keep both my mission, let's say, that serves the heritage site as a kind of commodified, musealized heritage site, but also how can I also reserve, especially in the case of Argentina, Argentina, Mike, because you talked about the survivals and the emotional relationship to the survivals. This is also very important because these were the main force behind Esma all throughout these years. So as an institution, if that happens, it takes also some work on your side to think actually, how can I keep this place as a site of reflection, as a site of learning, for example? Yeah, it also with an eye on what's happening, not just what happened in the past, but also in future political violence cases, etc., as you said, in Latin America. So this I think, the institution should be prepared to work with different strategic missions and to try to protect its actually conceptual strategic mission. With all regret, all these heritage sites, even Auschwitz, even the most visible sites, yeah, in many ways, they throughout the years, as Andre knows, become actually places of fetishism, yeah, and actually it becomes like a niche, you know, like also even tourism is very important for financial reasons, but of course, productive force. But it can also ruin your site. You see, so it's a kind of double-edged force. It's important to, as an institution, I think, to keep this in mind, to keep the positive aspect of transforming, but also to try to create a kind of internal structure within the institution to safeguard the ethical or the conceptual mission of the site.
Okay, good point. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to let Mikey have the last word on this. Please, Mikey.
How difficult to have the last word. Very short on my side. I would like to highlight this last exchange. The content of the permanent proposal, of the permanent standing of the museum is based on judiciary witness of the survivors. What I mean here is that this is the foundation of the museum, the judiciary witnessing, not just witnesses given in interviews simply, or content expressed by poems or books. The permanent standing of the museum is based on judiciary witnessing of the survivors. Plus, well, the institution, as he has well said, we need to have other tools, other strategies and mechanisms to hold the museum live and get closer to the youth. The youth is the largest audience of our museum, and these tools are the memory pedagogy and all the other tools that the museum holds, from being women in Esma that I mentioned before, all the way to the visits at 5 o'clock, the visits that we perform every last day of the month. The convening topic was the works on memory, the films related to memories, the books, poetry or poems, artistic installations. And also I would like to highlight that for us, it is a big concern in the framework of this candidacy, all this strategic plan that has to foresee the consequences, possible consequences of being included in the World Heritage List. One of them is the expansion and massification of the visits related to tourism. I mean, just that, Alia.
It's a good place to end. We have so many questions here that we couldn't quite address, but I hope that we were able to, in summation, do them, because I'm very conscious that we are going to have to end at 8:30, Abu Dhabi time. So I hope we were able to address most of them. There will be a recording of this available, and I think it'll be of great value because we heard some very interesting things. Before we leave, I want to first thank all three of our speakers for joining us today from Buenos Aires and Amsterdam and Cape Town. We're moving out of Zoom, but it's nice when there is Zoom to be able to bring the world together this much. And I also wanted to take time to thank Nahid from the NYU Institute for handling multiple logistics for this particular event, and also to thank Robert Partesius at the Dakar Center for Heritage Studies, and also Veronica Pereira at the Center for Heritage at Dakar Center, because she really juggled a lot of balls as well to make this happen. It's such a fascinating topic, and it's so interesting to have this conversation. So I'm sorry that we have to end it, but thank you again, and maybe we'll do this again in person. And especially, I think we're all curious to see what happens to both these sites as they're both evolving. Okay, thank you everyone, and good night.